want to welcome you to the Career Tracks in Military and Foreign Affairs session. We have 3 here and 1 to come, amazing, talented speakers who can answer your questions and tell you all you need to know to be successful in both. If you would, as they are talking, as they're introducing themselves, if you have questions, put them in the chat box, and I will go through and pick out the best questions to ask them as we go along. And for now, though, I would like each of them, starting with, I'm going to go by my screen from top left to right and then bottom. So Rachel first, Remoshay second, and Farah third. If you would introduce yourselves, tell people who you are, what organization you're with, and a little bit about your background. Rachel, you're muted.
Good evening. My name is Lieutenant Rachel Thomas. I am an active duty naval lieutenant. I am what's known as a foreign area officer. So we are the Navy's diplomats. Some of my career or my State Department colleagues sometimes scoff at that, but I still say it. I am a Indo-Asia Pacific specialist, and I am currently detailed to the State Department in the Office of Global Women's Issues, working on women, peace, and security, peacekeeping, countering violent extremism, and UN Security Council resolutions. So happy to be here this evening and happy to answer any questions you may have about the military track or what I can discuss about the State Department. Thank you.
Remoshay, you're up.
Hello, everyone. My name is Captain Remoshay Nelson, and I am the Public Affairs Officer for United States Air Force Air Demonstration Squadron. And a little bit about me, I attended Howard University before I commissioned into the Air Force. My first assignment, I was a diversity recruiter, and then I got involved in public affairs, become a public affairs officer in Delaware before going overseas. And I served as the public affairs officer for a base in Turkey, for another base in Korea, and a public affairs planner in Germany for 2.5 years. So I spent most of my time as an Air Force officer serving overseas. I'm happy to answer any questions you have regarding the Air Force, foreign affairs, and public affairs, and what that looks like. Thank you.
Farah.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Farah Pandith. I'm no longer in government, but had the honor of serving in 3 presidential administrations, the last one in the Obama administration, where I was the special representative to Muslim communities. It was a new position that was created for me by Hillary Clinton to engage with Muslims around the world. I've worked at the National Security Council, at the U.S. Agency for International Development, and obviously at the State Department. I am a pioneer in countering violent extremism. I am the first person on the ground developing the strategy for CVE right after 9/11. So I've been doing this for quite a long time. I've written a book about the experience of our country after 9/11 and how we've tried to engage on the ideological fight, what we were calling the war of ideas at the time. And right now I'm at the Harvard Kennedy School, where I'm a senior fellow, and at the Council on Foreign Relations, where I'm an adjunct.
Thank you. And before we start with questions, I guess it's only fair that I sort of tell you viewers who I am. Retired Ambassador Charles Ray. I spent 30 years in the Foreign Service, serving as ambassador to Cambodia and then to Zimbabwe. Before joining the Foreign Service, I spent 20 years in the Army, and I too was a Foreign Area Officer for Korea for about 10 years. And one of my State Department assignments too, by the way, was as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. So I've had my feet in both ponds for a long time. And with that, I'd like to sort of kick off the questioning for each of you in the same order that you introduced yourself. You sort of talk about the trends in your career fields and the gaps in the field, or the issues that you've had to face in your careers, and what coping mechanisms that you've developed to deal with them. Rachel?
Sure. So some of the gaps in the trends I think that I've seen is attempting to explain, especially with women, peace, and security, since I come from a Department of Defense background, attempting to explain my job and why we work on women's empowerment and gender equality to people who usually think very strategically, who think tactically, and where they see sort of my job and the job in my office as very what we would call soft power, and not traditional security. Whereas what I do is I bring in women's empowerment into better known as hard power and traditional security, understanding the linkages between women, peace, and security and women's empowerment and gender equality writ large into a country's stability and sustainability within peace processes within the security sector. So a lot of the gaps that I have seen just within this space, but also within the people that I'm working with, is a gap in the diverse perspectives that different cultures and different communities bring to the table when we discuss these issues. A lot of times when we work with other countries, we try and make a point to make sure that they're talking to men and women in that culture and in that community to make sure that they're getting what's necessary on the ground. But a lot of times within the foreign policy space, especially from what I've seen, I've only been at the State Department for maybe about a year and a half now, but it's kind of similar to the Department of Defense and the Navy, whereas there aren't enough diverse perspectives giving their influence and their input into these processes, so that when we provide a recommendation, a policy recommendation, things like that, it ends up only being part of the equation. So that's something that being invited to talk to within this panel and this career fair is to try and get more people with those types of diverse experiences, their lived experiences, to work in this space so that we can actually provide a very substantive and comprehensive policy.
Thank you.
Awesome. So very similar to Rachel, I think she did a great job speaking to making sure that we have the appropriate people in the spaces. That is the same exact thing with the Air Force. And I'll talk a little bit internally to our organization, so I don't share some of the similar views as Rachel, but I would say internally, the Air Force is still improving upon recruiting that diverse talent and making sure that we have on our side representation to meet and to bring to the table when we are discussing certain initiatives, operations with foreign governments. So having diverse officers. And so the struggles that we see there, even here, is making sure that people are aware of the opportunities in the Air Force overall, knowing that there are scholarships available to individuals who are interested in foreign affairs, and knowing the type of positions that you can actually get into. I was one who came in a bit ignorant. I knew that the military was all around the world because that's honestly why I wanted to join, but I wasn't sure of the officer positions. It's a very small percentage, but in doing that, I think it's important for people, one, to know that there are positions available, especially leadership positions. A lot of the leadership positions in the Air Force are not very diverse. So those are some of the things that I've struggled with, that I've seen in my career thus far. So finding ways to reach out and share those opportunities with other people, I think will definitely be helpful in making sure that the Air Force reflects the same countries that we are trying to engage with on an international scale.
Farah, you want to give an answer to that, and then we'll get to Samantha. She can introduce herself.
Sure. So I think it's important to just sort of state the obvious, which is the public sector has a problem with diversity, period. No matter what part of the interagency you're talking about, I would absolutely say throughout my career, that's been a gaping hole. We haven't done enough, and it speaks to many issues that both Remoshay and Rachel sort of outlined. But the ambassador asked some really important questions around your particular field and gaps in your training. And you know, our nation has done a lot in in soft power, the non-kinetic component of diplomacy that we use to solve a lot of problems. But we were not looking at the ideological manifestations of the war on terror in the same way right throughout these 19 years since 9/11. There are huge gaps in training, so that when you look at the professionals who are being asked to develop programs and ideas around CVE, it's become a field that it's just sort of you kind of go through and do your thing, as opposed to real specific expertise that's brought to the table. If you're talking about Korea, or you're talking about human rights, or you're talking about other issues, you have area expertise in that area. CVE is not a one-size-fits-all. You have to have deep understanding of both the radicalization and recruitment process, alongside a lot of aspects to the fight that are non-existent at the Department of State. So the huge gaps for me has been sort of a multi-sectoral view of how you look at the problem-solving skill set in soft power. And even though I'm in the field of CVE, I can say across the board, we get very siloed. We have problem-solving skills that are very one-dimensional. And I think what the ambassador asked in terms of how you cope, I mean, you either can get unbelievably frustrated, or you can figure out where you build your allies. And for me, that was the way in which I went about things. You know the goal you want to get to. It is not a question of simply saying yes and we'll do something. It's a question of making sure that we are doing what we say we're going to do. So what does that mean? If I don't have the skill set around me at the Department of State, I figure out who in the interagency does. Build the team that you need to build to be able to do that. So, Ambassador, that's how I dealt with some of the problems that I dealt with as we navigated through things. And I think it's an open question, certainly, as we're looking at the threat terrain for the years ahead. How, I think, my view is how successful we are in getting ahead of the enemy means our ability to bring in diverse thinking, new kinds of problem solving elements, which includes different kinds of teams, and getting out of that siloed approach that it's only a one size fits all that can answer the mail.
Great, thank you. Samantha, you want to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are, what organization you're with, and the questions that they were answering when you came on was, talk about the sort of what are the trends in your particular career field, what are the gaps in training, and how do you cope with them?
Okay, great. So I'm Samantha Turner. I apologize for being late to a military panel. I originally commissioned.
We're not able to hear you.
Are you able to hear me? Who's able to hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you loud and clear.
Remoshay, you can't hear me.
Sorry.
Okay. Everyone else can. So I'll just say, so I commissioned as a United States Army officer, graduated from West Point in 2009. I was an engineer officer. I was in the Operation New Dawn. And then after I transitioned from active duty, I transitioned directly to federal service. And from there, I've kind of been a civil servant ever since. So that was around 2014 until present day. So I have a very deep DoD experience. And Farah, like some of the stuff you were saying, like we deal with that type of stuff in DoD a lot. I do have a creative problem-solving background. I'm a professional facilitator in that respect. I do diversity inclusion facilitation, and I do a lot of work with the folks at UCOM now surrounding some of the new mandates that the Secretary of Defense has in helping to guide some of the diversity inclusion work that we're doing at UCOM, which we can talk about later. But, one trend that I would say, Ambassador, is, just now with everything that's going on, I think a lot of the events that have happened over this year have really pushed to the forefront the absolute necessity that we address the inclusion problem that we have within the Department of Defense, specifically within leadership. And I view, kind of one of my roles is as someone who is able to basically take the privilege that I have as a white person, as someone who didn't have the barriers that a lot of persons of color do when they come into federal service, and then to actively take the microphone that I have and give it to other people and to sponsor people, as we were talking about how it is that we build an organization that's more inclusive and that's able to make lasting change that really, it's a national security issue. So that's kind of a short, and then we can keep talking, but I'm so excited to be here.
That's great. Thank you. You know, I think, you know, what you said about diversity and inclusion was I think very on the money, but I'd like to throw out a slightly different question. I think everyone agrees that we really need to do more when it comes to ethnic diversion within our military and foreign affairs leadership structure to ensure that we have a diversity of views in the decision-making process. But looking at the 4 of you, and 3 of you are military or ex-military, leads me to another question on diversity and inclusion that I wrestled with for the entire 30 years that I was in the Department of State, and that is being women and going into this Department of State, particularly in the areas where you're working. Do you find barriers to full participation in what's going on? That's one. And 2, being military, do you find those barriers are even doubled? And how do you deal with it?
I'll defer to Rachel.
Rachel.
So, I mean, Ambassador, that's an extremely poignant and timely, I think, question, because we're seeing such an interesting influx when we talk about diversity and inclusion. There's differences between diversity and inclusion, say in the private sector versus in the military versus in civil service. Coming into the State Department as both a military advisor and as a woman has been interesting. As I mentioned earlier, trying to discuss women, peace, and security with a lot of people who don't necessarily see the ties between women and countering violent extremism, or women and the security sector. And I've heard people talk about, why should we care about women in the security sector? And sometimes I'm thinking, do you not realize that I am a woman in the security sector? and so it's a very interesting sort of dynamic coming in the military, and I think in the State Department as well. We do have barriers in terms of when everyone's heard of the Old Boys Club and those events where it might not be explicitly mentioned, but there are events or social gatherings or meetings that happen where you just feel either excluded, you weren't invited, things like that. And they a lot of times will use benevolent sexism, saying, oh, well, we thought you were doing this, we thought you might want to stay home with your family, we thought this and this. And so those things perpetuate these barriers, and they make it very hard for women and women of color to get in these spaces. And actually, I'm going to do a quick shameless plug for a working group that my colleague and I are working on in WCAPS that we are just about to start. And it's called Cultivating Common Convergence. And what it is we are trying to bridge the gap in facilitated discussions between the military and civil society, so that people understand that we are having the same sorts of issues. We, in the military, we care about family, about healthcare, we care about work-life balance, about diversity and inclusion, about social justice. But a lot of times the narrative is such that the military is seen as this monolith of people who have committed war crimes in Afghanistan, or people who are on the wrong side of the George Floyd protests and Black Lives Matter movement. So it's a really interesting question. That's something that we're still trying to deal with in both those areas. So just seeing the differences and the similarities between the barriers at state and the barriers within DoD has been sort of eye-opening. But also there are things that we are doing inside the military and inside state to help with D&I, diversity and inclusion efforts. That's a kind of a long-winded thing. We can talk a lot about this, but I will yield the floor.
Farah, I know you're not military, but you had to deal with the State Department as a woman, so I'm sure you have an interesting perspective.
Well, it's kind of funny, isn't it? Because, you know, when I first entered the State Department, we had a female Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. And, you know, when you have symbolism, whether it's Secretary Rice or Secretary Clinton, it's sort of this idea that women are in power. There's a sense that you see them. And I remember, and forgive me, that I am I'm quite direct. I remember, for me, coming to state from the National Security Council, one of the things that struck me as bizarre, and because I had never really been at state, was that everybody that was answering the telephone was female and Black.
Yes.
And it blew my mind. I mean, it blew my mind. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand why people couldn't see that. It's like everybody that has power is not that, but the people that are answering, I mean, it was just really weird. And so my consciousness around that at state really led me. I mean, I wasn't a foreign service officer. I was a political appointee in both Bush and Obama. So I came with a very different perspective. But what I noticed when I traveled around the world and got to know so many foreign service officers and civil servants is that, you know, there weren't enough women who were at the highest ranks. You know, you were seeing foreign service officers, but they weren't excelling to the higher levels because they had not been mentored and moved and whatever it is. But also around the policy tables, Mr. Ambassador, I mean, where were the women? I was sitting here looking around tables going, you know, why there's one or two who are sitting in these big meetings that really matter. And so for me, that consciousness really came very strongly. You know, I was working the EUR Bureau at the time and had wonderful teams. Please, I'm not at all speaking about that. But I think that for sure, there were no Muslim women. Let me just tell you that. I was the only one. There were very few people that I could see myself as. And I'm a pretty confident human being. That wasn't a problem. But it bothered me from the perspective of how the heck are we going to build the kind of capacity that we need on issues of diversity and different kinds of diversity if there were not people in the pipeline. And so one of the things that I did actually, Rachel sitting here from the office that helped me, was that we built a program called the Women in Public Service Project, because I remember being in the sit room in the Bush administration. And, you know, you can see I talk with my hands. I was sitting in a room, we were talking about something to do with terrorism. And at the time, the rooms they've been made bigger, but they was very, very small. We were all kind of pushed in. And I was sitting at the table and I was using my hands and I moved my hand like this and I looked up past my hand and I suddenly saw the room very, very differently. And I kept looking at uniform after uniform after uniform filled with men. I looked around the policy table, it was all guys, and I began to fume. I mean, I'm surprised that smoke didn't come out because I was thinking, we're talking about Al-Qaeda, we're talking about serious issues. Where are the women? I don't understand this. And I remember walking out from the White House to the EEOB across that little hallway and street, and talking to a colleague of mine, and I said, how is it possible that we are in the situation where I was the only woman in the room? That is insane. And when Obama became president, we went to Hillary Clinton, Milan Verveer, who used to run the office that Rachel's in right now, with this idea that we start something to get women to come in. Now, it's a long way of answering the question, but I think today, I wish I could tell you that in the year 2020, I'm looking at a different mindset at the Department of State where I'm seeing, boy, this is a new era. I'm not at all. And it's very frustrating for me not to see women at the higher levels of the Foreign Service, not to see women in the pipeline. And what breaks my heart today is that when I talk to young women who want to join or are really interested in foreign policy, they're worried about not having an equal opportunity when they enter state or any other part of the interagency to actually use their skills. I mean, this is not a session about and I could tell you all the horrible things that have happened to me we all have our stories, but what I want to do is to bring the consciousness level to the place where, as caring patriots, that we are building a country that has the kind of infrastructure, diversity-wise, that allows us to reflect not diversity, but reality of who we are as Americans.
Samantha.
I was like totally vibing with what you were saying, Farah, because it's so interesting. And one thing I didn't mention, so I'm the gender advisor to the commanding general here. So I do a lot of work that's very similar to what Rachel does. And as you can imagine, my job, like literally my job title, is triggering for people. And one thing that I've always found that is very interesting about this job, but then now about this moment, is that people, and I'm going to go ahead and say a lot of white people, are really exploring their privilege. And it's almost like it's this thing that's always been there, and now people are seeing it. And it's the same thing when you talk about gender and gender discrimination. It's always been there, but then when you see it everywhere. And it is infuriating. And I have been talked to by my doctor about my blood pressure because I do the exact same thing. I go on NATO exercises as a senior advisor, and I'm the only woman in the room. And I'm younger. I've got silver hair, but not enough. So, it's very, very interesting, how all of these things layer on top of each other. And, I'm not a person of color, but I'm exhausted. And so I can't imagine, having these other layers added. But when we talk about, there were a couple of things, Farah, that you said that I'll riff off of, being the only woman in the room. I think that really emphasizes the need for us to really sponsor people and bring people with us, right? And that's something that, I think anybody who's in a position that's a higher position, we can do that. But being in an environment where we are empowered to do so, and being in an environment where men are empowered to do so, because we can also layer on top of, race and gender, we can layer on top some of the attitudes about even being close to women. And I think the past 4 years, even being seen with women, I think the past 4 years have really brought that into sharp focus. And of course, we could talk about all of the different barriers we had in military service, or being the most visible. That's a thing that people say about veterans. But, I think, when we're thinking about solutions and what the change that's needed, I think now is really the moment for that. And I'm seeing a huge swell within the veterans community that's very, very much super encouraging with efforts like what Rachel was saying, the group that she has with WCAPS, and then, of course, getting people in when they're in political appointee positions and having them bring people with. So, yes. So that's what I have to say.
Well, thank you. Fascinating. Yeah, I would like to throw a bit in. I as I said, 20 years in the Army, 30 years in the Foreign Service. I've seen what you're talking about. And often noticed myself, because I was raised by my grandmother, so I'm pretty sensitive to the strength of women and what they're capable of doing. But what I've been working on several projects lately on diversity, and what I've been trying to get across to people is that it's not just racial bias, it's not just gender bias, it's the fact that we all have internalized, as we grow up, certain biases, and you can't avoid them because they sort of impinge on your existence. But if you don't have self-awareness, if you don't make yourself aware that they exist, then you find yourself unconsciously acting on them and being unaware of the negative impact that it's having on people around you. And the example, I've had that, talking about being the only one in the room, from my time in the Army in the 60s through much of my time in the Department of State, because I focused on Asia. I was the only one in the room. When I went to China in 1983, there were in the embassy and 3 consulates, there were 3 African Americans in the entire country.
Wow.
And 2 of them were specialists. So I was the only African-American FSO for about 2 years in China. Thailand, I was the number 2 in the consulate in Chiang Mai, and stand out like a pimple on prom night. In Cambodia, and so I know what you're talking about there. But there are other types of unconscious biases that can be just as corrosive. And the one that irritated me most during my time in the Foreign Service was the fact that I was a career military person who entered the Foreign Service, and that I would find myself sometimes being in places where by my grade I had no business being, simply because, oh, he was in the military, so he could talk to these guys. I mean, just the assumption that he thinks like a military person. I've actually had people look me in the eye and say that. Or you don't want to send him to that place because he's too military. He won't be able to adapt. So it's getting people to recognize that this exists and that they can control how they act. They can't control how they think, but they can control how they act and what they say. And that takes a lot of self-awareness. And I think having people like you, I mean, I'm one of those in-your-face types. If you're causing a problem, I'm going to get in your face with it. And that's what you have to do sometimes, unfortunately, is you have to get in people's faces until they wake up and realize what they're doing. And I applaud what you're doing. I'm like you, Farah. I mean, this is 2020. We aren't supposed to be having these problems in 2020. I recently got involved in this whole issue of the Customs and Border ICE people treating people of color differently when they come through ports of entry. And I was fuming when I first read that because, I mean, 2020, yeah, that happened in the 1980s and maybe even in the 1990s, but 2020, for Christ's sakes, that can't still be happening. It is. Male chauvinism, if that's a term that's even used anymore in the Department of State, still exists. Trust me, the old boys network is, in fact, it's not just an old boys network. I'm going to say something that's probably shot. It's an old white boys network. It's an old East Coast Ivy League college white boys network. And the only way you break into that network is you make a nuisance of yourself. This is a question I'd like to, I have a question here from, and I'm not going to try and pronounce your name, Mr. Bracey, because I'll mess it up. He had a question, and that was, could any of you discuss the future role of public affairs in the U.S. military? Rachel, you're active duty military. Let you take a whack at that first.
Sure. I wish Remoshay was issues joining in, but public affairs in the military is a very interesting beast, because how do you do public affairs in the military without you looking too pro-war or too pro-social justice? It's a very, and I'm not a public affairs officer, however, they play an extremely important role in how we show the general public what we actually do as a military. And so a lot of times people, Ambassador, like you're saying, people come in with biases. And when people interact with military officers, you can see I talk with my hands also, so apologize if you see them flying around the screen. But when people talk to a lot of military, they have automatic biases on things that are happening. I will talk about the negatives. You hear about the rampant sexual assault harassment in the military. You hear about the diversity issues. You hear about gender inequality, sexism, racism, all of these things. And you also hear about, and hear rightly from other people, what we're doing in other countries. There are things that we've done in other countries that a lot of military members would never condone, but it's things that have happened. And a lot of people that I talk to, especially as a foreign area officer, not a lot of people understand or know what a foreign area officer is. We're a very niche group of people. we are on the, I don't like using this term, but to the left of bang. We're the ones who are trying to find that diplomatic solution before we have to look at stabilization, look at combat, look at what we do in a wartime scenario. And a lot of people don't understand what we do or why we're there. So the public affairs piece of it, understanding that the DoD and the military does so much in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. We do a lot with social justice. Like we're trying to do better, but understanding the diversity of things that happen in the military. A lot of people just see the jets and they see the ships and the weapons, but there's so much more. And not necessarily saying that defense should be doing all of those things, like USAID, Department of State. They have grassroots organizations, civil society organizations have a lot of experience in doing stabilization and conflict prevention and conflict resolution. But it's just understanding and showing that representation. So a lot of times, especially with women, but also with like women of color, with people of color, we've seen numerous times that if they aren't represented, if people aren't represented in the highest ranks, why would I, as a woman of color, try and break into a system that and you can look right now, unfortunately, most of the people, most of the admirals and the flag officers in the military are white men. And so like when I'm presented with that sort of organizational chart of people, why would I want to try and get into that network? Because no one like me, no one who looks like me is at the top. However, we're starting to get there through initiatives, and we're starting to have those experienced men and women, those experts and those amazing leaders finally break that ceiling and get up there. So representation of that, and the public affairs space is huge on that, is showing that representation, where we have come from, still how far we have to go. But telling that story is something that I think is really going to help with diversity. On the public affairs part, we also have to like break down the systemic sort of hierarchy that prevents a lot of people from getting in there. But that's what I see as the public affairs portion of play a role in defense.
Thank you very much. I'd like to add something to what you were saying. I was the assistant public affairs officer at Fort Bragg in the 1970s, to sort of put military public affairs in perspective, and going back to what we were saying about the entrenched attitudes within the organization. One of the big differences, I think, between military public affairs and the public diplomacy we do in state is that the military also has an internal information system, command information, which is part of public affairs, that communicates these messages also within the organization, so that the messages we're sending to the outside world are also being shared with the members of the command. And for some reason that I have never been able to figure out, we seem reluctant in the State Department to have something approaching command information so that we communicate these types of mores and customs to our own people. I mean, we're good at communicating to foreigners what they should be doing and how they should be thinking, and we don't do it in the US at all, but we also don't do it within the organization. I mean, it's shocking. I don't know what to say. We have there's two other questions here. I wanted to address this one, Zaid Ismail, who his questions, my comment about the Old White Boys Network, he says, making him afraid to apply to the intelligence community of the State Department. He went to a state school, not Ivy League. His parents immigrated from Afghanistan prior to the Soviet invasion. He knows a couple of languages and has traveled and studied abroad in the Middle East, hoping that would be something to look at. And I would like to say to him that it definitely is. I mean, if you already speak a couple of languages, by all means, take the Foreign Service exam and do all you can to get in, because they need you, brother. They really, really need you. And as for, I think, as you know, Farah said earlier about being the only Muslim woman in the room. When I first entered the Foreign Service in 1982, I don't think I knew anyone in the Foreign Service who was Muslim. But over time, and particularly after 9/11, you started to see more and more when we realized that we needed people who spoke these languages. My last assignment as ambassador to Zimbabwe, I had 2 Muslims on my staff, one from Afghanistan and one from Pakistan. 2 of the most amazing people, young second tour officers, 2 of the most amazing people that I've ever worked with in 30 years. So that's changing. You look at me, I'm not part of the old white boys network, but I managed to come in out of a 20-year Army career, fought that stigma for 30 years and worked my way. And I came in, by the way, as a junior officer. I didn't come in as a mid-level. So I worked my way up from the bottom to retire after 2 ambassadorships and senior foreign service. So I'm proof it can be done. If you're persistent, if you do your job, if you don't take no for an answer. I take no as a maybe. It's just, that's my philosophy. So
could I say
yeah.
a word? I
Yeah.
would just, I wanted to just say 2 things. The first is, don't let any obstacle make you not follow your dream. I mean, are you kidding me? You have a desire to do this, whether it's the intelligence community or state or whatever you want to do. So what if there's an old boys network? So what? Go in, do what you can do, shine, be who you are. It isn't what's happening in 2020 doesn't mean it's going to be the same way in 2025 or 2030. We do not know the future. If you have a desire to serve, please jump on board. I couldn't agree with what the ambassador said. I mean, we need people like you. Jump right in. And then the other thing I was simply going to say is that what the ambassador said about us not, you know, when 9/11 happened, we looked around and we didn't see enough people in the places we needed, you know, and we were scrambling. We worked really hard to try to convince people like you that that this is a career that you want. So I would hate for you to walk away from a national security need that we have, which is we need people who have the languages that you have, that have the background that you have. And Rachel talked earlier about different perspectives at state. One of the things, and it's not just because you come from an Afghan background that you're only going to be working on Afghan affairs, it's that you've traveled, you've been around the world, you have a different sense of a different perspective. Those perspectives help you solve problems and help Americans solve policy problems in different ways, because even though that may not be the area that you think you'll be interested in, let's suppose it's climate change that you're talking about, you may have an experience that you can bring to the table that will add some value to the way people think about solution sets. So I really do hope you'll jump in.
And don't think that you have to make that contribution in the Muslim world.
Right.
When I went to Cambodia as ambassador in 2002, this right after 9/11, we were pedal to the metal for outreach to Muslim communities. One place in the world where we were not reaching out to the Muslim community was Cambodia. And why? Because no one in the East Asia Bureau was even aware that Cambodia had a Muslim population. 6% of the country are Cham Muslims, who are about the most underprivileged, marginalized community there. When I went back to Washington asking for funding for my Muslim outreach program, I was laughed at first. So, you know,
Mr. Ambassador, what year was that?
2002.
Gosh, there's an entire chapter in my book that I open up from when I was special representative and I had gone to Cambodia to engage with Muslims.
Yes.
And I'm gonna and by that point, this was 2009. Your bureau was going, oh yes, there are Muslims in Cambodia. You need to go engage with them. So
they knew
after you came to them.
Well, but you know, and this, you know, the point here is talk about, you know, being suffering bias for being military. The reason I knew that there were Muslims in Cambodia is because in 1968 through 72, when I did my 2 Vietnam tours, I was unfortunately part of the operations that bombed them almost back into the Stone Age. And so I ran cross-border operations into Cambodia for a year. So I knew that area like the back of my hand. Nobody in the State Department seemed to be aware of this population that, one, they're Muslim. Two, they had no reason to like the U.S. because we bombed about 60% of their villages out of existence. And three, the Cambodian government was ignoring them. I mean, it's ripe for extremist recruiting. And so, you know, this point of diversity of views that you've all brought up, this, for me, is an example I use. This is the perfect example of why you need to get diversity of views. You get someone who traditionally been involved in Cambodian affairs, and it would have been the same old thing over and over. Samantha, you had your hand up. Go.
I wanted to kind of elevate this and just say that, you know, I think cultural competency and cultural understanding and empathy, when you're taking a human-centered approach to design solutions that are population-centered. So basically foreign affairs, you know, taking a consultative approach to, you know, we're coming in, we're kicking the door in and saving the day, you know, instead asking people, you know, hey, how is it that it's working here? And then, you know, for example, the question that was asked by Zaid, you know, that innate understanding that you have, a good leader should come to you and should say, hey, we're going to be going into this place at this time. I understand that it's around the time of Eid. What will everyone be doing? How should we behave in order to be good guests? Are there things that we should bring? And you know, a good leader will lead with questions and they will ask you those questions, Zaid. But we need people like you who know those answers, who are kind of trusted people that are on our team, as it were. You know, we need those people because right now there's a lot of misunderstanding and there's a lot of hurt between the national security infrastructure and the Muslim community. And, you know, that is going to take a lot of repairing. But I would really highly encourage you, you know, not to feel like the whole weight of the world is on your shoulders, but exactly what Farah said. We need you. Like, don't take no for an answer. Just try. Because, you know, I sincerely hope that change is coming and that we're going to be in a place soon where we can actually do the work of repairing those relationships, because understanding those types of things are going to be absolutely essential. You know, we're leaving Afghanistan right now, but we never leave, right? We always have an embassy there, you know, so those types of things, you know, if you choose to participate in the Middle Eastern, you know, kind of area, that could be your jam, or even consulting in Europe. You know, we need people who have different experiences, who don't have a very cis white kind of Christian view of the world, because, you know, we see that type of those mistakes being made again and again in foreign affairs. And, you know, look for those leaders who ask questions and listen. That's what I would say. Don't be discouraged. Look for those leaders who ask those questions and who value you, and go from there. So don't be discouraged if you get a bad leader, you know, like, hey, on to the next one, you do your job, on to the next one. But, you know, they're out there. They're out there, I promise you. I haven't found too many, but they're out there.
I'd like to underscore what she said. If you get a bad leader, and if you stay in long enough, you will. Just remember, tours are 18 months to 2 years, and so you'll get a new one. I have another question here from Terrence Groves. I hope I got that name right. And his question was, how do you balance family life with frequent travel, your spouse and children? You two look so young. I'm not sure that that's a question that you can answer. So I will take a stab at it, because I had to do it both in the military and in the Foreign Service with school-age children. And it's not easy, but it can be done. I mean, it's a matter of making sure that your family understands what you do as far as you can tell them, and that you consult them when you're making decisions on where you're going. make them, sort of make them part of get them involved in the process. And you'd be surprised that this actually can work out quite well. My two youngest, who are now in their 40s, by the way, grew up on military bases at a time when we were moving about every 18 months. And so by the time I retired from the military and joined the Foreign Service, they were in second and third grade. They'd already been to about 5 schools. And by the time they graduated from high school, they had been to 10 schools in 4 countries. You would think that would sort of mess with a kid's head, but in fact, they turned out to be, two of the most, one has an MBA and the other has 3 or 4 patents, and keeps getting scalped from the companies he's in at a higher pay to go to the next one. And so, and they have families, but they have an outlook that's so different from their American high school classmates. They graduated from high school here in the US. I made sure I was back here for that. Both of them have passports. Very few of their Wooten High School, Wooten here in Rockville, very few of their Wooten High School classmates had passports. They think nothing when travel was easy of going to the airport, buying a ticket, and taking off to Costa Rica for the weekend. It's just, hey, it's what you do. And, my daughter, when she traveled with a New Zealand friend of hers who was here, they went to the West Coast, and they went from California up the coast through Canada into Alaska. And she insisted that the Canadian border people stamp her passport. She wanted a memento of being in Canada. I guess what I'm trying to say is it depends on how you approach it. If you look at it as a problem, then it's going to be a problem. But if you approach it as a united family, then there are great rewards for it. We have family get-togethers now. I have 3 grandchildren, and we amaze them sitting around telling stories about their kids, their parents when they were younger, and the places they, like my son and daughter riding their bicycles on the Great Wall of China. Who wouldn't be amazed by that? Rachel.
I say, really a slightly different perspective on that side is my dad was in the military, but like the travel that we did was when he worked for a Ford Motor Company. And I grew up a little bit in Portugal. I grew up in Michigan, but we would travel a lot. And so what that did for me was, like Ambassador Ray was saying, is it really opened up my horizons. And sometimes I didn't like it. Like sometimes it does. It's a little bit of a growing pains, especially with kids going through different schools or understanding, like just having to change every so often. However, growing up, I didn't have an issue with traveling. Like I loved it. And I just understood so many different cultural things. I just understood that the world was such a bigger place and wanted to learn more. And that's actually one of the reasons that I joined the Navy, was to continue traveling and to continue experiencing different cultures. So I've always seen it. And I have friends who, I was stationed in Japan for 5 years, and I have friends who put their kids straight into a Japanese school, like no English. And some of them, their 12-year-old, she speaks fluent Japanese, and she goes back and learns it. So she is already has this huge opportunity and this propensity for a very difficult language. And it comes naturally to her because she got that opportunity. So if I have to go abroad again, the Navy sends me abroad. I have no issue if I end up having kids, no issue taking my kids overseas, because the benefits highly outweigh any sort of negatives that I've seen so far.
Samantha, you have something?
I'll also say, so I've lived in Germany now for 11 years, and I've got, friends all over Europe and all over the world. But one thing that I would say, and Terrence is, it's not all or nothing. It's not, you're going to travel all the time and you're going to be gone 3 out of every 4 weeks. You can have an assignment where you do that for, 18 months to 2 years, just like the ambassador said. Or you can maybe take a desk assignment for a little while if you guys need a break. And I this is not a relationship advice, like, career track thing, but, a lot of that is negotiating with your significant other. What does that look like, right? And involving them in the process. And then once the kids are old enough to get a vote, potentially involving them, right? But one thing that I will say is, Rachel is exactly right. I grew up in a place where if you told me when I was 30 some years old that I'd speak fluent German and had lived in Europe for the better part of a decade, I would have laughed in your face and been like, absolutely not. That's not true at all. But, it's been so difficult for me to learn those languages as an adult. If I ever have children, they will at least speak 2 to 3 languages. So, I think that, the travel, the exposure, the understanding, the empathy, the culture, it is one of the hugest benefits of military service or, State Department service, the way I see it, or federal service in general, right? Because it's not just state and it's not just the State Department and the military that get to do it, but it's also USAID and then FBI, Customs and Border Protection. We have liaisons over here as well. So the sky's kind of the limit. And if you can get the opportunity to have an adventure and instill that in your kids, especially if you have daughters, that empowers them to be more worldly. And it really, I think, has a very positive benefit on their secure feeling when they move throughout the world, which is something that a lot of women, unfortunately, specifically in the United States, they don't get that feeling. So being able to teach them exactly as the ambassador said, hey, go grab a ticket to, Jamaica for the weekend and head down there and then come back. That is freedom of movement, and being able to do that type of stuff, especially as a woman, is one of the most empowering things that you can give to any children or spouse that you would have. So I would highly encourage it and say that it's not all or nothing. It's a dance, right? But yeah, no, 100% go for it. Like, it's totally.
Well, we were supposed to stop at 7:15, and it's now 7:35. I don't want to keep you two ladies longer. I know you well, and you're in Germany, so you're still on a work day, right? Or is it in the middle of
It's
the night?
1:30 a.m. right now.
Oh my God, I'm having trouble with that.
We can drop our LinkedIn profile. There's a couple questions people are asking if we can connect. We can drop our LinkedIn
Sure.
in the chat probably. But.
Yeah, I have to find my LinkedIn profile too. Yeah, why don't you do that? And want to thank both of you and your other 2 colleagues who had to drop off for technical difficulties. It's been a fascinating discussion. I know I learned a lot from it, and good luck to all of you participants. We're happy that you could join us, and we will see you at another time and another place. And I'm putting my LinkedIn profile on here now. Well, it didn't all come out, so I'll have to finish in a minute. Let me get it right here. Oh boy, I love computers when they work well. When they don't work, well, what can I say?
My computer crashed at the beginning of this.
I was running 2 workshops this summer, and I got up one morning, I turned my computer on, and my desktop was gone. Just literally gone. And I didn't figure it out right away. I calmed down, and I went to my garage where I normally go when I want to think. Then I came back. I got my standalone hard drive, and I reloaded stuff, and
Wow.
sort of got it halfway back, and then I stopped for lunch. I came and I pulled the plug on the computer. I just pull the plug out. That's what I always do when the computer doesn't work. Unplug it. I came back. I plugged it back in, and when I turned it on, my desktop was back. Mystery. Well, I finally found out what it was. Microsoft was trying to peddle their new Windows And at one time when I was on, they had put it into my computer, and when you first logged on, their new window would come up. And if you didn't want it, what you had to do was log off and log back on. It took me a day to figure that out. So yeah, computers are great things when they work, but boy, do they drive you nuts when they don't.
That's why I
If
switched
anybody tries to get to my link, it's not going to work because I didn't type it right.
I'm so sorry, guys.
Well, welcome back. We're done, but so
I
the participants
noticed
wanted.
the audio went out when I
There
saw
we
the
go.
name
The
of Sam.
participants wanted contact information.
Okay.
So they will probably send questions directly to you if you give them your contact information. Thank you all for outstanding presentations, and good luck to all of you in your careers. I'll be watching from the sidelines. And thank you, participants, for joining us. And with that, I will say good night. Take care.
Good night. Go Navy, beat Army.
Go Army, beat Navy.
Go Navy, beat everyone. All right. Have a great night.
I'm with you on that, Samantha. Go Army.
Yes, that's right. 2 against 1.
Yeah.
You say you want to get in on
Well,
this?
actually, I should
We
count for
remain
2. It should
above
be 3
all,
against
so-
1. I'm
Okay,
I'm probably almost as old as the 3 of you put together. Take care.
Thanks, sir.
Hello? Oh, girl.